Back in April, I made a video talking about my most wanted matchups for a versus show called Death Battle, and I thoroughly enjoyed making that video. It was really fun talking about a show I liked, and the reaction from all you guys in both views and comments made it even more worthwhile. Plus, while we don't have many details right now, it seems like the gang behind the show is going to keep the ball rolling for even longer. However, not everything can be all sunshine and rainbows, and now it's time to do what we did last time, but in the opposite direction. With how much everyone talks about which characters they want on the show, over time, you start to develop some aversion to the idea of certain characters being featured, whether the reasons are a lack of combat abilities, no real compelling story, just being a bad character in general, or other personal reasons. I'm sure anyone who's been involved with the show for long enough has developed such feelings with at least a few characters, and I personally have 10 in mind that I don't want to see on the show really at all with most of them. Of course, a list like this needs some rules in order to make my picks make sense, so let me outline them right now. Number 1, no characters that have appeared multiple times on the show. For example, I can't just pick Shadow or Batman purely on the basis of not wanting a 4th or 5th episode featuring them. I mean, I don't, but you get the idea. Number 2, no real people. Death Battle does occasionally use real people like Chuck Norris for episodes, but they usually lean into their fictional nature in order to make them work better, with one notorious exception. So while I'm not the most comfortable with them using real people, the way they go about it makes it okay most of the time. Number 3, no characters or non-combat related media. What I mean by this is that I can't just pick a character from, say, a dating sim or a rom-com, since that's way too easy to do and wouldn't feel fair to the other choices. Number 4, no religious figures. There's something to be said about using religious figures purely in a combative sense, but I feel like they know this well enough since the only one they've done as of writing this was Hercules vs. Sun Wukong, which was handled okay. So I'm not going to include any other deities from separate religions, but they better not touch Jesus. In my book, that's a crime. And lastly, number 5, no characters that I just don't like, with one exception. Something like that would also be really easy to do, so I did avoid picking characters I dislike, except for one, because I might as well have at least one. Also, as a disclaimer, these are all my own personal opinions. If you disagree, that's perfectly fine. I just don't want these characters in Death Battle. With that said, let's jump on in and get them ranked. Our first entry is a bit of an interesting case, as he's not necessarily a character I don't want on the show, it's just that given his unique nature, I believe he'd be really hard to work with in an episode. And that character is the one and only Captain Olimar from Pikmin. Now, those of you who played the games and or watched my E-Raws on the series would know 2 things about him. 1, Olimar is perfectly capable of kicking ass and taking names. He's got feats, a lengthy history, and a wide arsenal thanks to the Pikmin. 2, he's only 4 centimeters tall with his spacesuit on. That's 1.5 inches for those of you who don't understand math, and that's exactly the problem with Olimar being on the show. His size makes it so that almost any opponent that's taller than like half a foot would completely mollywop his ass. He may have taken down some relatively large creatures in his adventures, but a lot of those are the size of a tarantula at best. There's also the fact that most of his abilities and feats come from the Pikmin he utilizes, and that's another thing that limits his potential on Death Battle, because you can't just throw random characters that have barely anything in common into a matchup. They gotta have at least a similar theme or combat style going for them to make it interesting. So who out there in the great media landscape will make a great opponent for Olimar both in size and combat abilities? GB Robo? He's a singular robot that doesn't fight in all but one game that nobody likes. Wonder Red from the Wonderful 101? Yeah, he's got an army, but he's the size of an average human. He just needs to step on Olimar. Milo from Tinykin? I guess that could work, but it's also just a boring Sonic vs. Lilac kind of matchup where you have a guy from an indie game that's inspired by a major franchise fighting the guy from said franchise. Plus, as someone who's played Tinykin to 100%, Milo has 0 combat experience since there's no fighting in Tinykin, so the matchup is even more one-sided now. But wait, I hear you say, can't they just size Olimar up to his size in Smash Bros., kind of like what they did for Kirby and King Dedede? Well, with the highly debatable exception of Kid Icarus, not only is Smash Bros. Explicitly non-canon to the franchises featured in it, including Kingdom Hearts regardless of what Madman Nomura says, but Kirby's canon height of only 8 inches is never a factor in any of his games. Everything in Dreamland and the other worlds he visits might as well be normal locations you and I would visit. Heck, in Forgotten Land, he gets sent to what is heavily implied to be a ruined Earth, and he's shown to be around the third of the size of an average car, so there's even more proof for you. With Olimar, exploring ordinary areas at the size he is one of the main appeals of Pikmin, so sizing him up would kind of misrepresent Pikmin on the show. Plus, Kirby has the benefit of pulling off several cosmic level feats, while Olimar at his best can take down a mutated Venus flytrap. As it stands, unless there's some ultra obscure character out there that makes a good opponent for Olimar, there are just too many issues present for me to take him seriously on the show. If they ever found a way to make it work, then I'd like to see Pikmin be represented in some way, but as it stands, I'm not dying to see Olimar on the show anytime soon. So remember how I said that Rule 5 would exclude any characters that I hate/dislike with only one exception? Well, this is that one exception, and I placed them right here purely to just get them out of the way. Folks, meet Viola from Bayonetta 3. Now, Bayonetta as a whole, I feel had its time on Death Battle already, with Bayonetta vs. Dante, which was a great episode. I've seen people want Bayonetta again on the show so she can have a more up-to-date examination, but due to Bayonetta 3 implying that the Bayonettas we played as throughout the series were separate versions, which complicates things, and a lack of other relevant matchups that aren't just Dante again, I don't think Bayonetta herself really needs another look on the show. Beyond her, Jean would just be Bayonetta again since she fights very similarly to her, and no one's asking for Rodin. That just leaves Viola, and while she does have enough material to work with for an episode, I just can't stand her in the game for a variety of reasons. The first reason is she barely gets any time to be an actual character in the game. Yeah, she kickstarts the plot and everything, but outside of a handful of moments where you get to play as her, she isn't really seen doing much. What doesn't help is that on the occasion we do see her, she's treated as an absolute joke, and a bad one at that. For every moment where she's doing something cool, there's at least 5 other moments where she's treated like a punching bag, and it just feels unnecessary. We already had 2 comedic foils in lovable ladies man Luca and stereotyped swear machine Enzo. We don't need another one, especially considering her supposed role should be taken more seriously than it is. And as a result, nothing she does feels earned. Not her revealing that she's the daughter of Bayonetta and Luca from another universe, not her getting a devil trigger form, and especially not her taking over Bayonetta's mantle at the end. Good golly, I hated that. To add further insult to injury, her voice is permanently set to yell regardless of the situation, and that got annoying fast. The only good thing about her is her gameplay, and even then, she's really just a lesser Bayonetta, which makes sense narratively, but doesn't mean I have to like it. However, I might not outright hate Viola despite all that, if it weren't for one final thing that pushes it over the edge. And that's the fact that Viola, in terms of her story, gameplay, and character as a whole, is a blatant copy, no scratch that, blatant ripoff of Nero from Devil May Cry. Just think about it for a second. Both of them are children of one of the main characters of the respective series. Both of them are confined to a single melee weapon in their gameplay. Both of them take over the main character's mantle by the end of their games. Both of them earn a demon form at a pivotal moment in their stories, and look at their character designs! Seriously, how can anyone defend this? There's a fine line between taking inspiration and asking for a lawsuit, and this is writing the damn thing yourself. That's why I hate Viola. She's not funny, she's not important, she's barely competent, and she's a ripoff of an infinitely better character. If they seriously want to continue the franchise with her as the main character, they need to either give Viola a major character upgrade or just retcon her out of existence. I would prefer the latter, but the former would be serviceable. Just please don't put her in Death Battle. For the love of Jubileus, please don't.
Okay. Let's dance, baby!
Resident Evil is a franchise that has a variety of fan-favorite characters that could be used in Death Battle, yet strangely the franchise has only ever had one character, that being Leon Kennedy, be represented on the show. I mean, I get why he would be the first, but he's not your only option. We got daring heroes like Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, and we got terrifying villains like the Tyrant Nemesis and the walking Matrix reference Albert Wesker. Even beyond them, I could see smaller characters like Ethan Winters being totally viable for Death Battle. However, there's one character that's strangely popular amongst the fanbase, yet I couldn't care less about. Number 8 is Rebecca Chambers. Now, Rebecca has only been featured in 2 games as of writing this, Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 0, and I've seen several people say they want her to appear again in some way. However, I genuinely don't see the appeal for her, nor do I think she would be a good fit for an episode of Death Battle, mainly because she isn't seen doing a whole lot in both of her games. In Resident Evil 1, she's barely a footnote that cowers in the corner from a hunter and walks around the mansion with Chris, not really doing anything of significance. In Resident Evil 0, she not only shares the spotlight with Billy, a character that's even more one-note than Rebecca, but she also doesn't do anything usable in an episode. Yeah, she kills the Queen Leech with Billy's aid, but that's really her only notable feat in a sea of other more usable characters. Even Claire has more to work with than her. What else is there to say, really? She doesn't do anything, I don't even know what her character is, and I genuinely don't know how they could possibly use her in an episode. What do you people see in this character? Seriously.
Thank you, Rebecca.
So dragons in various media have been wanted in Death Battle for a long time, and I don't blame anyone for doing so given how awesome dragons are. I myself want to see Ridley get his own episode, I know Pokemon fans want to see Rayquaza, and there are plenty of others that could be used. However, not all dragons are created equal, and for every world ender like Bahamut Zero, there's a town level loafer who barely does anything. Number 7 is Smaug from The Hobbit. Or Middle-earth, if you will. Now listen, Smaug is a great villain. I really like him, especially when it comes to the Hobbit trilogy. Say what you will about those movies, they did Smaug so much justice there. It's just that the reasons behind why he's such a cool threat in the context of the Hobbits don't mesh well with the first's landscape. What makes Smaug cool in the book and the movies is how woefully outmatched Bilbo and the dwarves are against this creature that took over a kingdom. Bilbo especially, since he's standing before this thing that could kill him by breathing hard enough and has to use every clever word he can possibly muster to buy time for the dwarves. The destruction of Lake Town also works because almost every person in the town is defenseless against his might, and the one person who isn't barely accomplishes it in time for all the remaining people to live. All the while, Smaug openly mocks him, believing that he will die like the rest, only for Smaug himself to die afterwards. All of that is great in the context of the Hobbits, but when you start analyzing him in a versus sense, you quickly realize that a lot of what he does isn't very impressive. From the beginning of the story to his death, Smaug's only feats are destroying a nearby town on his way to Erebor, smashing down a giant wall, surviving being buried in a river of liquid gold, smashing down the same giant wall again, and setting fire to a town for a bit before dying. That's it. And with his only real abilities being flight and breathing fire, his combat potential is extremely low, to put it nicely. That honestly says it all, really. He may be a terror in his own world, but he's no titan among dragons, that's for sure. Horror is one genre that hasn't seen a lot of attention on Death Battle compared to other genres, and that's a shame since there are so many options you can use. Movies, games, shows, books, you name it, and it probably is a character you can use in versus. Granted, their strategy appears to be reserving them for Spooky Month, but even though that makes sense, doing only 1 or 2 horror episodes a year on the show, I feel does a disservice to such a great genre. That said, there are some sections of horror that don't necessarily lend themselves that well to a Death Battle episode. Groups like the SCP Foundation and Creepypasta are good examples, as a lot of the characters present in both don't have a lot to work with for an episode. But even they have notable characters like the Scarlet King and SCP-682 for SCP, and Sonic.exe, Slenderman, and Zalgo for Creepypasta that have plenty you could use for an episode, even if you'd have to dip into fanon content for some of them. However, there's one franchise that has a rather surprising amount of requests to be on Death Battle, despite having almost nothing to work with for almost all of its characters. And said characters are the FNAF animatronics. Just all of them. I know this sounds like a bit of a generalization, but since most, if not all, the animatronics in FNAF suffer the same issues, it didn't feel right having just one character be representative of FNAF as a whole. Now with that said, I've seen people express how disappointed they are that the people behind Death Battle don't take FNAF seriously. But none of this is without reason, as FNAF is incredibly antithetical to Death Battle's format. First of all, there's the big issue of having just way too many characters. Or rather, too many versions of the same character. One of Death Battle's core rules is to take a character at their absolute best, but due to the existence of so many different versions of characters, that makes it incredibly difficult to take most of them at their best. Let's take the main man, Freddy, for example. The OG is really nothing special. He's a basic pizzeria animatronic that happens to be possessed by an angry soul, so he doesn't bring much. In fact, I'd say he's the 4th weakest version of Freddy after Wither, Molten, and Phantom Freddy. Even Rockstar appears to be at least built a little better. Beyond that, we have Toy Freddy, who, like the other toys, is logged into a criminal database and can detect a predator a mile away, and is built like a dump truck given his size and metal exterior. There's also Funtime Freddy, who's 6 feet tall, has a mechanism to kidnap unsuspecting kids, is surprisingly quick in the custom night, and is made out of titanium, making him far tougher than Toy Freddy. But even he's outclassed by our most recent Freddy iteration, Glamrock Freddy. He's the most advanced animatronic we've seen yet, with an AI that's borderline indistinguishable from a human's, and is basically a walking tank made for birthday parties. And even then, he gets even stronger in the same game by obtaining Roxy's eyes, which let him see through walls, Monty's claws, which helps him smash through gates, and Chica's voice box, which lets him screech at animatronics to make them run away. You guys can see the problem, right? How can we possibly enforce the rule of taking a character at their best when the character has too many versions to take into account? This isn't like Goku's ever-growing list of forms that continuously prove every older form you once cared about obsolete. These are separate characters that can't possibly be combined into a single entity, and that's without taking into account that all the versions I mentioned aren't seen doing a whole lot. Most of the Freddys I brought up spend their time wandering around dark rooms and occasionally having a staring contest with you, and even Glamrock Freddy in his decked out glory isn't seen doing much besides breaking through gates and getting disassembled by some staff bots. You can also apply this to the rest of the main four, as they suffer from the same problems. And outside of them, who do you really have that has enough material to work with and is popular enough to be asked for the show? Looking at your options, you have Circus Baby and her alt Scrap Baby, who don't bring much due to spending their time monologuing in the dark and wandering around events, the rarely seen Golden Freddy, who has maybe 2 or 3 abilities usable in combat, and the even rarer seen Puppet, who also doesn't bring much due to spending most of his time listening to music in a box. The only remaining option you could use to get anything out of the FNAF cast is to use fan-made videos, but unlike SCP or Creepypasta, where the videos mostly depict either the canon stories of the characters or how the characters would act outside of their original stories, FNAF fan videos tend to take a lot of liberties given what little we know about the characters. Sure, sometimes they can accurately depict the characters, but more often than not, they do their own thing as opposed to staying true to what little lore we know. Despite that, I'm not totally against the idea of FNAF Beyond Death Battle, as I do think it could be both interesting to see how they would go about examining it, and funny to see them go crazy over the mess of ideas that is the lore, but most of the cast just doesn't work for me, even with matchups that I'm interested in. Springtrap is one of my favorites, as cookie cutter as that sounds, and I have interest in him fighting either Junko from Danganronpa or Chris Walker from Outlast. However, even though Springtrap is the most viable option for versus, even he's guilty of the same problems as the rest of the cast, since most of his feats are either said and not shown, or implied through background details. Plus, there's his form as Glitchtrap, which not only suffers from the same problems, but also faces the issue of how to composite him into Springtrap. Oh yeah, and there's also but hey, people can like what they want, I guess. If you want to support Freddy Fazbear versus Chuck E. Cheese, go ahead. I'm not gonna stop you. Sonic the Hedgehog has had a bit of an iffy history in Death Battle, and even with the wider Versus community. I've gotten into many discussions over how powerful the Sonic cast is, and it genuinely feels like unless you're talking to a fellow Sonic fan, most Versus debaters refuse to place most of the characters above planet level, and any and all instances of universal and even multiversal scaling, of which there are plenty in the games, will be written off as outliers and misconceptions. It's happened so often both in and out of Death Battle that in recent years, I've actually dreaded upcoming episodes that feature Sonic characters rather than be excited for them. Of course, that's not to say I don't want Sonic characters in Death Battle at all. I want Bowser vs. Eggman so they can finally stop doing Mario vs. Sonic, and I'm interested in Tails vs. Coco, but beyond that, the feeling of unease always comes up whenever a Sonic character gets announced. Now, as of this video, they've used just about every major character that will be requested for an episode, with one exception. And given their treatment of the others, I'd rather it stay that way. Number 5 is Blaze the Cat. Now, Blaze is a fan favorite amongst Sonic fans, and I myself love her just as much as the next person. However, given her status as one of the more powerful characters in the roster, there's always that lingering question in my mind whenever she's discussed for an episode. How are they going to butcher her? Because even if they portray her character accurately, there's no way they will genuinely accept her for how powerful she really is, since they haven't done so for the others. Let me put things into perspective so you get a better understanding of what I'm saying. Given the events of the Sonic Rush games, Blaze easily scales to Sonic, much like Shadow, and Sonic has taken down characters like Eraser, Jin, Emerald, and Infinite who can reach cosmic levels of power while in his base form. Heck, in Eraser's case, he had most of his life force drained from the spell placed on him, so that's even more impressive, yet neither Death Battle nor most Versus debaters are willing to acknowledge this ever. Furthermore, as her super form Burning Blaze, she, along with Supersonic, took down the Egg Salamander and the Egg Wizard, the former of which held the power of the Soul Emeralds, which dragged Blaze's universe into Sonic's for them to merge, and the latter had the power of the Jeweled Scepter, which basically held universal domination. Those are pretty blatant universe-level feats, so where's the issue? Shadow versus Ryuko. In that episode, they calculated the Chaos Emeralds moving pieces of the Earth in Sonic Unleashed, and used that as Shadow's best feat. And since the Soul Emeralds are equal to the Chaos Emeralds in power, this directly contradicts this. Now you see the problem. What is Death Battle reasonably going to do in this situation? This isn't new information. Sonic Rush is a game from 2005. It was always available for Versus analyzing, but they just chose to ignore it. Given that Burning Blaze's only appearances are in the Rush duology, they wouldn't have much choice but to use these feats for direct showings of power, despite contradicting prior research done for other characters similar in power. Of course, there is the option of either massively downplaying these feats, or even flat out ignoring them and fully relying on scaling, but that does a huge disservice to the character and would piss off a lot more people than if they were to just bite the bullet and accept they messed up, even though they more than likely never do that. What especially doesn't help any of this is that we haven't seen Blaze in any real action since Sonic Rush Adventure back in 2007, with any game since only featuring her in kart racers, non-canon mobile games, a side mission where she only spams one move that's not all that useful for a Versus fight, and another universe where she cosplays as a knight. That last one, by the way, isn't even the real Blaze despite similar looks and mannerisms. On top of that, all the matchups I've seen for her have ranged from mediocre to incredibly bad. Like, there's Blaze vs. Daisy, which is the overdone Mario vs. Sonic matchup that's incredibly one-sided, Blaze vs. Elsa, which is the boring Fire vs. Ice matchup that's also incredibly one-sided, and Blaze vs. Starfire, which is probably her best option, but still doesn't interest me due to a lack of knowledge on Starfire outside of Teen Titans. Ultimately, that much is a footnote compared to prior issues, but it's still worth bringing up. I'm sure some of you might think I'm overreacting as a Sonic fan and that Death Battle doesn't treat Sonic that badly, but if you take a minute to look how they examined Sonic in Mario vs. Sonic 2018, you'd quickly realize how dirty they did him. They refused to place him faster than Lightspeed despite multiple sources and moments in the game showing otherwise, some of which are even shown in the episode yet lazily hand-waved away. They glossed over Super and Hypersonic while giving them literally no scaling, and despite giving Sonic access to all the Wisps, shields, and both sets of emeralds, the animation proceeded to have him use only one Wisp that's not even close to his best choice, the Bubble Shield which off almost immediately, and Hypersonic which leaves Supersonic in the dust. Not to mention allowing Star Mario to not only tank hits from Hypersonic even though he can't even survive lava, but also last just long enough to run out at the same time as Hypersonic does, even though the power-up can't last more than 10 seconds without a steady supply of stars. Sure, you could point out that Mario was also done dirty since his cosmic level feats were also ignored, and they completely bastardized his character by making him act like a borderline psycho when Mario is one of the nicest, most upstanding gentlemen you'll ever meet. However, the issues were a lot more apparent on Sonic's end, to the point where the episode was practically rigged against him. That might not have been the intention, but that's how it felt. This trend even persisted into Shadow's third episode with the aforementioned planet level calc, despite evidence that Shadow's way more powerful than that, especially when scaled to Sonic. Granted, he still ended up winning, as he should have, but he was still massively downplayed as Sonic characters generally are. As such, a similar thing would likely happen to Blaze, and that's just not something I want to see. Maybe casual fans who don't know a whole lot about the series will get a kick out of it, but as someone who's deeply invested in Sonic as a whole, and as Blaze is one of his favorite Sonic characters, I can't say that I'd be happy to see Blaze get an episode because I know one of two things will inevitably happen. They'll either bring up her best feats as Burning Blaze, but heavily nerf them to say around planet level in order to not contradict themselves, or they'll completely ignore those feats and just rely on prior inaccurate scaling. We narrowly avoided that happening to Silver. What makes you think I want the same for Blaze? Some of the most requested characters for Death Battle come from the indie scene, and not without reason. There are many candidates out there that could be used, and it boggles the mind that the only one that's been used thus far is Shovel Knight. I mean, beyond the several I myself have in my list of most wanted matchups, Hat Kid from A Hat in Time is a good choice, Spark the Electric Jester versus Sash Lilac has potential as a matchup, I know several people want Shantae to get in, and even Shovel Knight has gotten enough new stuff to warrant a second episode. That being said, not all indie games are created equal and have characters that are compatible with Versus. but it appears that some people are so desperate for indie game representation that they'll ignore this fact and just pick anyone for the show to use. Mild spoilers, the next 3 entries all share this similar theme with differing levels of absurdity, and the first of these is a character that has a shockingly high amount of people asking for him to be on the show, despite having no way to fight anyone. Number 4 is Boyfriend from Friday Night Funkin'. Listen, I like Friday Night Funkin'. I'm more interested in the mods than the base game, but said game has its charm. But Boyfriend has no conceivable way to fight an opponent. And I'm not just saying that because FNF is a game with minimal fighting outside of Tankman's Week and the recent Weekend update. Even ignoring the fact that his character is the equivalent of that one type of meme that blows up every now and then and is only funny for like a day before becoming the most obnoxious thing in the world, Boyfriend is literally just a rapper that wants to date a random chick that happens to be a demon. In the entirety of the base game, the only time Boyfriend does any fighting is this brief scuffle with Daddy Dearest in the newly added intro. Beyond that, there's nothing you could work with for Boyfriend in the base game. And even if you dip into the many mods, it doesn't get much better. First of all, there's the issue of how to properly scale Boyfriend, considering how different each mod treats him. In one mod, he's rapping against God himself, yes, that's an actual mod, and somehow lasting more than a second, and another, he's getting murked by a bog-standard Among Us imposter. Very sharp contradictions in only 2 mods. And that's not even going into how Boyfriend is able to fight in these mods, which just make him look pathetic even by average human standards. And since a lot of people are too ignorant to acknowledge this, let me go over every option in the mods that Boyfriend has at his disposal for potentially beating someone in death battle. Number 1, rap battles. This is the only thing that carries over from the base game, as it's the one thing Boyfriend is able to do in a fight. But while Boyfriend himself can die losing a rap battle, very rarely does he kill his opponent by winning the rap battle. Most mods out there usually either fade to black or have a cutscene with a different outcome entirely, so that's hardly reliable. Number 2, special notes. A lot of mods have special notes that can affect the gameplay of the song, but very few aid Boyfriend offensively. Lots of times they're either death notes that can't be hit otherwise you take damage, or defensive notes that halt the opponent's attacks. Not a whole lot are the offensive type, and when they are, they usually result in number 3, throwing his mic. Some mods allow moments where Boyfriend can throw his mic and disrupt his opponent, such as in Indie Cross and versus Stickmen. But as you might imagine, a microphone isn't going to do a ton of damage when thrown, even if he throws a bunch of them like in versus Stickmen. Number 4, screaming. In a few mods, Boyfriend can use his lung power to scream incredibly loudly, such as in Indie Cross where he screamed loudly enough to push back the Ink Demon, and the Trolls Files where he finished off the villain by screaming. However, unless his opponent is incredibly weak to sound, Boyfriend isn't going to kill anybody simply by screaming at them. That's basically all of Boyfriend's options for actually fighting somebody, and as you can see, none of them are very useful for an episode. He doesn't have any real way to kill an opponent outside of maybe throwing enough microphones. Like, at least his only real opponent, Parappa the Rapper, knows karate from what I've heard, despite facing similar problems as Boyfriend. Boyfriend just has nothing, and it's amazing how nobody who wants him on Death Battle sees that. And no, you can't include Girlfriend in this because she's a separate character. And what's more, how would you even scale her? You can't scale her. She's never done anything. And Twitter posts from the Funkin' crew don't mean jack when they're a bunch of clowns that took 3 years to add 3 animations, a score screen, and a single extra week. Ooh boy, if you thought people wanting Boyfriend on Death Battle was absurd,
get a load of this!
Monica from Doki Doki Literature Club is an outrageously popular candidate for Death Battle, and frankly, I just get more and more annoyed every time she's brought up in a versus sense. Now, if you don't know who she is, I'll tell you. Monica is one of 4 high school teenagers in a literature club, hint hint, and like the others, is constantly pining for the main character's attention. Except it's a little more than that. It's revealed later on that all this time, Monica was hacking the game to take out each girl one by one and have you, the player, all to herself. She manipulates Sayori's depression to the point where she offs herself, Yuri's obsession to the point where she too offs herself, and Natsuki's... Actually, Natsuki just kind of disappears, leaving you and her alone together in a void of what's left of the game, forcing you to either spend eternity with her or delete her character file in order to restore the game. It's a well-executed twist in an otherwise pretty ordinary dating simulator, but it's when people try to turn those events into a power set for Monica that I take issue with it. Nearly everyone who brings up Monica in a versus sense views her as this reality-warping, fourth-wall-breaking goddess in the game, but when you actually look at what happens in the game, that mindset is a severe misconception of what Monica did. Her manipulation of the girls was only done by changing the values present within the character files that she herself says are foreign to her, so she didn't fully understand what she was messing with. And when Sayori went through with it, that act nearly destroyed the game. Monica was barely able to salvage it in any playable state. Hell, in the final act with her, she states that she can't really change anything in the room you're in. She can't add things, change the endless abyss outside, or even change the music. So not only is she unable to do any master manipulation without values within character files, which again, she isn't familiar with, but she also can barely do basic coding within the game itself. Even worse, it's incredibly presumptuous to assume that if you placed her in any other world against an opponent, that world would have files with values for her to manipulate. And even more presumptuous to assume that if a character invaded her world, there would automatically be a file for them with values to manipulate. Really, the only thing she can do is delete files, and even then, that has a giant asterisk on it. In the final act, Monica admits that deleting the files is a scary task for her, and that she's afraid of deleting herself if she deletes too much from the game. Maybe she could go nuclear and erase everything like in the bad ending, but the only reason she even did that is because she had nothing left. The game was irreparably damaged by her actions, and Sayori, now with her newfound knowledge of the fourth wall, would only continue to do terrible things if Monica didn't do anything. But wait, Tony, DDLC Plus implies that Monica's able to possess people. That's a viable feat. No, it's not. The most you get from that notion is teeny tiny breadcrumbs that are about as reliable as Microsoft at their bullshit studio closures. That's not proof. You people are reaching. And need I remind you that Monica, at the end of the day, is in fact an 18-year-old high schooler with no combat experience at all. Because that's really what you're left with since her supposed fourth wall mastery isn't all it's cracked up to be. And that's hardly interesting for an episode. But believe it or not, all of that pales in comparison to how bad her most wanted matchup is. There have been others I've seen thrown around, but the big one every Monica fan wants is against, of all characters, Flowey. Flowey, the psychotic sunflower from Undertale. Do you people not realize what this garden weed is capable of? Monica will be obliterated a million times over before she could write a single line of code. And you people believe she wins? What on earth are you smoking? Because you're so high you're on the moon. Originally, I had something else entirely for my number 2 pick, but then I discovered that this character had a couple matchups that people wanted for Death Battle. To be frank, this discovery greatly pissed me off, and I would go so far as to say that this character, along with number 1, cannot and should not be on the show under any circumstances. Full stop. Half the characters I've talked about are able to work in some capacity in Death Battle, despite my issues with them. And you might even be able to make some kind of argument for Boyfriend, Monica, and even some FNAF animatronics. But not these two. They can't work on the show, they don't belong on the show, and if you think otherwise, then you should be ashamed of yourself. Okay, maybe not that last one, but the point is, this is where I draw the line when it comes to characters being used in verses. So who's the first of these untouchable characters? Well, it's Madeline from Celeste. For those of you who haven't played Celeste, Madeline is a young woman with some crippling depression. She aims to cure this by climbing the tallest mountain she can find, in this case Celeste Mountain. Along the way, she meets new friends like Theo and the old lady simply called Granny, and she fights against Madeline, the physical manifestation of her depression. By the end of the game, she accepts Madeline as part of herself and conquers Celeste Mountain, becoming a new person as a result. Now, let's get the obvious out of the way first. Madeline is not a fighter. She may face some really hard platforming challenges as she climbs the mountain, but almost none of it involves any fighting. The one time where she fights is against Madeline in Chapter 6, and even then, she only really uses her dash ability to bash into her, which is extremely limiting for a potential fight on Death Battle. So Madeline is yet again a character with no combat experience that's ignored in favor of having a random matchup you really want. And this is where I discuss the darker subject matter. As I said, Madeline is a character with crippling depression, and her journey is all about confronting her inner demons. Celeste, as a whole, is praised by many as one of the best games to tackle a depression story, and I even recommended my sister play it when she was going through depression. It's a beautiful story, told with the right amount of grace and tact that is required. So to throw all of that away in favor of putting Madeline in a death battle is a huge misunderstanding of who Madeline is as a person. Some of you may say, well, if they focus on her story and who she is, it'll be okay. But the problem with that is that it doesn't matter how much they focus on her story. The main goal of a death battle is to put two fictional characters against each other to see who's stronger than the other. And Madeline is someone who not only can't fight, but I'd also argue wouldn't fight a random person she just met. Fan animations like Indie Cross where she can get into scraps are fine to me because the appeal of something like that is more on the characters interacting rather than trying to kill each other. And what helps is that Indie Cross doesn't portray her fighting, but rather using her climbing abilities to escape and survive. Death Battle just wouldn't do that because that's not the point of the show. And putting such a sweet lady who just wanted to find herself into a scenario where she's forced to kill some random stranger, or worse, get killed herself, is against anything I'd ever want to see. What's more, her only two matchups are just plain awful. You got Madeline versus Hat Kid, a character that she only has baseline similarities to, and Madeline versus Peppino Spaghetti because they both climb a tall thing in their games, and they both have anxiety. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This matchup is insulting. No, it's worse than that. It's a disgrace. The very idea that anyone would take a look at Madeline's entire journey, fighting her inner demons that took the form of pixelated eldritch horrors and an emo deity, ending with her becoming a new and better person, and write it all off as just anxiety, so it's comparable to Mr. I will jump scare the player if they take too long in the menu, is such a horrific disservice to the character and her story. You can try to deflect this with a bunch of feats from the game, but you will never get me to change my mind. I don't care that she survived tumbling all the way down Celeste Mountain. I don't care that she can dodge Madeline's lasers. I don't even care if you can put her on a cosmic level of power, which you can't, because none of that is what's important when discussing Madeline. What's important is the story being told and the tough but fair gameplay that it's paired with. Nothing else. Just leave her alone. Let her be happy, and don't you dare bastardize her for the sake of an episode. So after everything I've said, there's still one person left that I don't want on Death Battle. And considering how harsh I was when discussing Madeline, you're probably wondering who could possibly be left that I want even less than her. Well, ironically enough, it's a character that comes from my favorite game of all time. And despite of how controversial it will be, I will die on this hill no matter what. Undertale is a game that has many different characters, several of which are contenders for a potential episode of Death Battle. Sans, Undyne, Flowey, hell, my most wanted matchup features an Undertale character. But there's one such character that's arguably just as popular of a choice for the show as the others, that I believe should never touch the show at all. And that character is our player character, Frisk. I know how controversial this choice is. It's probably my most controversial entry aside from maybe Monica and the FNAF animatronics, but I genuinely don't want Frisk on the show at all. For those of you unfamiliar with Undertale, Frisk is the kid we play as for the entirety of the game, and as them, we can make choices that affect the world and characters. We can choose to spare enemies and be a pacifist, kill them all in a mass genocide, or do a mixture of both. This means that technically there are 3 different versions of Frisk across as many timelines: Pacifist Frisk, Neutral Frisk, and Genocide Frisk. And this is where crucial problems begin to rear their ugly heads. As I brought up with the FNAF animatronics, one of Death Battle's core rules is to examine a character at their absolute best at the time of an episode's release. And Frisk in their game is actually quite powerful. They've gone toe-to-toe with several monsters with magical abilities, have a few weapons and gear to work with, are able to repeatedly come back from death via their save points, and subdued a literal god of hyperdeath who had control over all of space and time. However, that was done as a pacifist in a run where they didn't kill a single soul. Not even Flowey, a nearly irredeemable monster that took pleasure in others' suffering. And therein lies the rub. Death battles are only won when one combatant kills the other, and the only times where that didn't happen are either because of jokes or they literally can't kill each other. Frisk likely wouldn't fall into either category, so in order for them to work in an episode at their best, they would have to go against their morality and kill someone, despite refusing to kill even the worst of the worst because they were just that kind. That's honestly the biggest thing going against them for a death battle episode, and there's not really much of a workaround you could use. Heck, one of the other core rules of death battle is to remove moral restraints to prevent characters from killing in order to ensure a fair fight, meaning Frisk would lose that choice they made that got them where they were in the best ending of Undertale. It's frankly character assassination to the highest degree, and it's just as bad as it would be for Madeline. As for the other versions of Frisk, Neutral Frisk is not only less powerful than Pacifist Frisk, but also has the problem of the sheer number of combinations you have. The neutral route involves killing and sparing any number of monsters, so you'd have too many things to consider for an analysis. Plus, they have next to no character to go over, so even if you could scrounge together an analysis, you wouldn't have much on the character front. Genocide Frisk, meanwhile, faces similar issues regarding their character just being a blank slate murderer, and is probably better suited to scaling for Kara if they were to get their own episode. And given the most powerful monster they fight is Sans, they're probably the weakest version of the bunch. Let me repeat that for those in the back. The version of Frisk that only fights is the weakest Frisk. As you can see, there's no real good option for Frisk any way you slice it. You can either use the most powerful version but completely bastardize them by forcing the sweetest child in the universe to break their moral code, use a weaker version that can fight but has too many factors to consider and barely any character to analyze, or use the weakest version that's even more bland and is better off to use as scaling for someone else. I know at least one person will try to bring up that Death Battle has used pacifists like Aang from Avatar and the Doctor from Doctor Who before, but neither are really comparable to Frisk. Despite their general love of all life, multiple iterations of the Doctor have shown to be willing to kill if absolutely necessary, and nearly everyone who's watched Avatar will tell you that Aang was butchered horribly in this episode. Frisk would likely be treated in a similar way, and I don't want that at all. The only way I can see Frisk working in Death Battle is if they calculate that whoever Frisk fights is too weak to kill Frisk, but Frisk won't kill them due to their boundless pacifism. But the odds of that happening are almost slim to none, especially given their most wanted matchup is against Ness from Earthbound. All of that and more is why I personally believe that Frisk should never be used in Death Battle. You can use other characters all you want, but above anything else, leave Frisk alone. Let them live their lives in peace as the savior and ambassador of the monster race and the kindest soul to ever exist in any media ever. And that's the list for you. Can't wait for the comments of this video to go crazy, but I felt it was necessary to speak as honestly as I could for this video in order to get my points across as thoroughly as I could. I hope you all understand. And hey, why not talk about some characters you don't want in Death Battle as well? I spent all this time talking about mine, it's only fair if you talk about yours. As for next time, it'll be more Kingdom Hearts with 358 Days Over 2, aka the black sheep of the series. Needless to say, I'm dreading this next one, especially since I already didn't like Chain of Memories, but I didn't buy a real DS copy of the game for nothing. It's part of the series, and I gotta follow through with my promise to the best of my ability. See you next time, everybody!